back to the Data Driven Recruiting Podcast. I'm Sophia Beck, and I'm joined by my co-host Tigran Sloyan.
Hello.
Today we'll talk about where and when to introduce assessments in your hiring process.
Awesome, yeah, and I'm excited to talk about this topic because last time we discussed how putting an assessment at the very top of the funnel can really help you increase that top of the funnel. But what we didn't touch on is that the only place you introduce assessments, or is there more to it? So I wanted to dive deeper into that topic.
Yeah, so share the best practice that you've seen in the industry, how we can actually design the whole process with assessments in there.
Exactly. So I think when you think about assessments and when you think about measuring skills, it's literally like a multi-stage process. On the one hand, you do want to put assessments at the very top of the funnel. But on the other hand, if you try to front load the whole thing, right, where you're trying to get everything you're trying to measure at the very, very beginning, you're just going to make it a very difficult and cumbersome candidate experience by making your assessments too long and by potentially getting some false negatives.
Got it. So does that mean if you front load everything in a very heavy assessment at the top, you might kind of see candidates not taking and completing the assessment?
Sure, and that's part of it. I think to give you an example, let's say we're hiring an engineer, right? Let's say I'm hiring a React engineer. Okay, obviously, if the listeners don't know what React is, it's one of the most popular front-end development frameworks. So if I'm hiring a React engineer, probably the skill sets that I'm interested in the most is I want them to know JavaScript, I want them to know React, I want them to understand web development. Now, if I try to measure all of that at the top of the funnel, right, I would have to make a really long test. So if I want to pack an assessment for React, an assessment for JavaScript, probably an assessment for HTML and CSS, probably some other things, it's going to be a very long and difficult test. And the candidate is going to think, well, I just started this conversation with you, right? Why are you throwing this much stuff at me while I'm not even committed to or might be not too excited about working at your company? And two is, in a lot of cases, you see that, I might be a great JavaScript engineer and I could pick up React really quickly if given the chance, but you would not be able to understand that if you're just doing an automated assessment at the very top and you're trying to judge me based on my React skills.
Got it.
So what we recommend to our clients is that if you're doing it at the very top of the funnel, you keep it generic, right? So in this specific case, I would say, hey, do a core JavaScript assessment. Just make sure they know JavaScript, and then it's worth your time to engage in further discussions and further processes, and you can measure the rest and be more specific and targeted later in the process.
I see. So start with something that's very fundamental,
Exactly.
Bottom line,
Exactly.
So that you pass kind of a one step, and then as you go, you customize based on what the particular candidate is about, and then what this particular job is about, and you kind of make it more in-depth.
Exactly.
Okay.
So I guess the second sort of layer from there is that, let's say someone went through your initial assessments, you went beyond resumes, you didn't judge them based on the keywords and schools that you see on their resume, and you've identified that they have the core skills that you're interested in, the high-level core skills that you're interested in, and then you move them to the next stage of the process. Usually the next stage of the process would involve either a phone interview. If it's an engineering role, it would be a technical phone interview with an engineer. And I'm talking about the assessment steps, right? There's other steps in the process, like a recruiter getting on the phone, pitching the role, getting them excited, maybe a hiring manager talking to them for a personality check. But I'm just focusing on all the layers of where do you measure talent and what does that look like. So the second layer is usually when this person has the basics. They have kind of a fundamental understanding of the skills that matter for this role. This is where you can get more targeted. You can potentially make the assessment piece a little bit longer because by now this person is more interested, more committed to making this relationship work.
Yeah.
And it's usually either a phone interview in which I can just hop on the call and ask you specific questions, dig into things. If I'm trying to measure your React ability, even if you don't know React, I could give you a basic React question and say, hey, can you Google your way into figuring this out and actually get to measure your ability to like learn on the spot while having all the fundamentals, right? If it's an automated test, which is again like a pretty good option if your recruiting volume is high enough where you can't just get phone interviews scheduled, you can still customize it to your needs, right? So like you could throw in a React question into that test. You could add more details to it. You can make the questions always the same. So instead of like just a generic standardized test that you do at the top of the funnel, you could, spend some time into tweaking the test and balancing it to be really related to the job that you're hiring for, and thus get a better measurement. Because the next step from there is going to be like, hey, I'm going to bring somebody on site, and when somebody comes on site, you're going to be spending several hours. So it's like a much bigger commitment from you.
Right.
But again, even in that middle stage, you don't want to try to get every single thing that you're hoping to get, because again, you're going to end up with either missing something where because usually, for example, it's one person evaluating, right, in the middle. If that person tries to measure everything, they might also introduce some biases into that evaluation, or maybe they're not an expert at a certain area. So you definitely want to leave the last touches of the skills that you're trying to measure to the on-site stage, while being sure, even more sure, that this person by now has most of the technical skills that you're looking for.
I see. So it's if we use an analogy, it's almost like, hiring and interviewing is a relationship building.
Exactly.
So it's more like, you get to know on a first date, are you, in approximately in the right place, are we a fit?
Right.
And then you go to the, second date.
Right.
And then ask more serious questions
Right.
about the relationship.
Don't push it too hard in the beginning.
Right. Don't ask are you interested in having kids?
on the first
date.
Definitely.
Got it. Yeah.
For sure. And I think when it comes to, getting to that last stage when you're doing it on-site, it's kind of like this layered process when you go layer by layer. The closer you get to the inner layers, the more sure you are this person is a fit, and the more excited they are. So you can also expand the time commitment and the requirements from the candidate to go through all of your assessments, right? So it's something to keep in mind. In a similar way, to continue on your analogy, you wouldn't ask someone to do the first date as let's just go on a trip together. It's just too big of a commitment. What if I'm not into this whole relationship, right? Why are you asking me to go on a trip?
Or is it even a serial killer? You never know. So get to know each other before you do.
Right.
Yeah. But so I like the whole kind of the design, thinking about the whole process, and then making sure that your assessments are also different and you're measuring different things that are more appropriate for different stages.
Right.
And I think that's a very thoughtful process. But for the on-site portion where it's several hours and you have multiple interviewer, how would you kind of design that particular assessment? What goes in? How do you make sure you are measuring various different skills, and how do you make sure also the interviewers know what they're supposed to measure in their own interview? Yeah,
and this is where it's very important to realize that you still got to be data driven. You can't be we'll just go off of our what our interviewers thought, right? That's what people usually say. We'll just bring them in, we'll throw some interviewers at them, and then we'll just get together, see what everybody thinks. Again, that's a good idea, but you can still apply structure to it. You can be a lot more organized and systematic about how you do that, and a lot more facts oriented rather than gut feeling oriented. To give you an example, for engineering interviews, obviously we know more about engineering and technical assessments than anything, so I like to use that as examples, but a lot of these apply to other types of interviews. For engineering interviews, companies who don't excel at being very strategic and systematic and data oriented when it comes to on-sites, everybody gets to choose their own questions. They're hey, we're interviewing this developer for a similar job that you have, or they maybe even give them the job description and say, here's what the job is, go come up with questions you want to ask.
Right.
So what ends up happening is everybody asks a different set of questions, right? Every time you go in, depending on how much you like that person on the first site, you pick one of those questions that you either want to go easy or you want to go hard, which makes it a complete inconsistency across the process.
Yeah.
And then they would use like a whiteboard interview. So like they would say, hey, here's a whiteboard, we're gonna write some code on it, which introduces its own set of complications. One is you're not capturing any of core like information that's going on in this interview. So whatever they do is just left and erased on the whiteboard.
And there's no record to go back to if you don't quite recall what exactly happened during it.
Or if you reconsider that candidate in the future, like you have no idea what the hell happened. All you have to go by is the notes of the interviewer. And some interviewers are not very good at writing notes. Right? So like, sometimes people are really good at writing systematic notes. Most people are not. And if you are trying to write really good notes, you're usually not paying enough attention to what's happening in the interview.
Yeah.
So it's really difficult. So like what companies who are like really good at assessments do is one, you clearly outline like what are the things we've measured already in previous assessments and what are the things that we're still left to measure. Okay. Then you say which one of the interviewers is focusing on which area. Okay.
Got it.
And then instead of doing it on a whiteboard, you actually use a proper interviewing tool that's going to capture pretty much everything that happened during that interview.
Right.
That can then later be analyzed, went back to, and discussed as a group, instead of saying, well, how did you feel about this candidate, right? Like, let's see what your notes say about it. And then you're like, oh, well, forgot to take notes. So should have done this sooner.
So having more of a blueprint to figure out exactly what you want to measure and where you're going to allocate that particular assessment so that everyone involved in the assessment knows exactly what they're measuring and then you can consolidate it later.
Exactly.
Okay, great. Well, so the last question I want to ask you is, can you summarize the bottom line of our podcast today in one sentence?
Yeah, well, I guess the bottom line here is that measuring skills and having a data-driven assessment process is not a single event, right? Like you can't just do it at the top or you can't do it at the end of the process. It's a multi-layer process, and as you go from the top, where at the top of the funnel your assessments would be more standardized, more high level, and fast, right? Like take shorter period of time. Later down the line, your assessments would become more customizable, potentially take longer time, and also be very targeted at the specific skills that you're trying to capture.
Great. Thanks for the insights.
Of course.
Thanks for tuning in. See you next week.